Unless you are indigenous, you likely came from somewhere else or are descended from someone who did. And if you are an immigrant or the child of immigrants, you may feel a tug toward the country of your ancestors. Now, a new book is exploring this identity through the concept of elsewhere. Pop culture writer, podcaster, and radio host Elamin Abdelmahmoud is the author of Son of Elsewhere, a memoir in pieces, and he joins me now. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. How's it going?
It's going great. Great to talk to you. First off, what made you write the book? And second, what does it mean to be a son of elsewhere?
Well, I really sort of wanted to explore this period of time right when I first arrived in this country. So I arrived in Canada at the age of 12. I arrived from Sudan. And 12 is an interesting kind of sensitive age because I think if I'd come a little bit younger, I'd maybe have less of a concept of Sudan and where else I'm from. If I come a little bit older, I think I would sort of be aware that no matter what, Sudan is sort of like my first homeland, and then Canada can't sort of supplant that. But 12 is this very sensitive period of time when you're trying to sort of play around with a bunch of identities. And for me, I moved to a city called Kingston, Ontario. Kingston is not a large town. There's not a lot of people who look like me in Kingston. And so as a result, I sort of found myself in, late elementary school, early high school, sort of engaging in this, what you might call just kind of, erasing certain identities, or at least like, trying not to talk about them as much as possible. I tried as much as possible not to talk about my blackness, about my Muslimness, about the fact that I'm an immigrant, just in order to try to fit in. I was okay. I just wanted to just sort of belong. And this book is an attempt to look back at that period of time and say, you know what, in doing so, I actually took away something from those identities because I actually sort of owe them, and I owe myself an opportunity to understand my own relationship to blackness, my own relationship to Muslimness, my own relationship to being an immigrant. So this book is more or less an apology, or sort of an attempt at an apology for that.
And when we talk about this idea of elsewhere, I take it to mean it's not an actual place, but more of a space in the mind between where you came from and where you are now. Is that how you would define it?
Yeah, I would define it as sort of the constant dance in between which place is home. I've been in Canada for 22 years. This is, for all intents and purposes, my home. But so much of the time, I sort of find myself debating the exact percentage of how much of myself to allot to my old homeland versus a new one. And I think this is a feeling that is familiar to a lot of newcomers, and it doesn't really go away regardless of how long you find yourself in this country. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time in that elsewhere, that sort of in between, that it's neither here nor there, it's a little bit of both. And what does it mean for it to be a little bit of both? And I guess like I think there's a common sort of pop culture idea of swinging in between both places, and I would like to sort of introduce and own the space in the middle, trying to say like this is actually where I build my house, in between the two spaces, and I'm okay with that. And that's a little bit of what elsewhere means to me.
And you find yourself, you're still doing that in calculus now as well?
All the time. And it's like the smallest things will trigger it. Like I will walk past incense and go, hey, that smells like Sudan a little bit. I'm a big fan of country music. Country music reminds me a lot of Sudanese music. Like there are just a lot of moments that invite me to remember my other homeland. And so as a result, there's this sort of balance that you got to strike all the time of being like, okay, I will be okay with living in the middle, whatever that means.
Now, you mentioned in the book you come to Canada from Sudan at the age of 12, going from Khartoum to Kingston, which is great. Both start with a K. It's
very helpful alliterative.
Very helpful as an alliterative device.
Yes.
What was the biggest culture shock to you arriving here?
I think the biggest thing was just seeing my dad speak English. That was sort of my very initial first shock. Because my dad left Sudan when I was 7. I didn't see him for 5 years, and then me and my mom joined him a few years later, which is a very common sort of immigrant story. And so I was really looking forward to seeing my dad, and really looking forward to reconnecting with him. And of course, when you're 7 and your dad leaves, you sort of like build up this image of him, and you try to sort of apply time to the ways that it might have changed him. I'm sure we had a lot of phone calls. At the time, this was in the late 90s, so every 6 months or so, I'd receive like an envelope with a bunch of photos that I'd be able to look through. But I didn't know the ways that he had changed. And so when I first arrived at Pearson Airport in Toronto, and the car pulled on the highway, and the 401 was an overwhelming sight to behold. But then we went to Tim Hortons, and that was the first place where I heard my dad speak English. I was like, wait a minute, the whole time I never incorporated this idea of my father speaking a new language because I didn't know how to speak English. This was all sort of new to me. And so I think that was my first initial culture shock. Everything else truly paled in comparison to, okay, I can sort of grab my mind around, what it means to live here, the differences between here and there. But my dad speaking English, that was, so totally new that it took a minute to adjust to that.
One of the great stories in the book is your cousin from Toronto handing you a couple of CDs. I think it's Lauryn Hill and Nas, and telling you you won't be around a lot of Black people in Kingston, but hip hop can help you connect to them. How important was music in helping you connect to this community, to your new country?
Well, let me tell you, first of all, I'm so grateful to that cousin for that early introduction, even though I didn't immediately take her up on it. But I would say that, like, for me, at first, music was sort of a strange bridge because I tried to like hip hop because, as my cousin said, hey, over here in Canada, we're Black. And of course, growing up in Sudan, I had a bunch of people who looked like me when I never had to think about my skin color or its implications. And so this was new. This was new, having to think about my skin color and its implications. And I grew up in a relatively conservative sort of Muslim household. And so when I was sort of pointed towards hip hop, I recoiled and I was like, no, like I don't want any of this. And so first I ran into metal music. That's where I started. I started with rock. I started with metal, mostly because you need music that can sort of express and counteract your angst in that period of time. It wasn't until some time later that I found hip hop, but I would say all throughout that whole journey, whether it's metal or hip hop or now country music, music for me has been kind of a key to unlocking a lot of what it means to live here. I take pop culture quite seriously. I get to write about it for a living. That's a part of my job. And so as a result, I'm very, really grateful to what pop culture has given me in terms of just like understanding the world around me, understanding my relationships to certain ideas that I relationship to this, and then music kind of showed me a different direction.
I think it's brilliant as well when you talk about later in the book how country music connects you to your old home, and you go through this great explanation of the Byrds and Sweetheart of the Rodeo and what that music means to you. I thought that was really powerful and a perspective I'd never heard before.
Thanks, man. Sweetheart of the Rodeo, great album, but also has this way of just kind of unlocking, I think, something larger in you. So for me, what I really connected to with country music was the subject matter. The subject matter was something that you just sort of so deeply feel because Sudanese music is so about space, about the literal geography that you occupy. And so is country music. And there's so much country music that sort of deals with the literal spaces where you are. I think Sweetheart of the Rodeo has a bunch of those songs that sort of specifically mention place. And I sort of was really struck by that because that was something that I was looking for in so much of North American pop music is I'm looking for place. I'm looking for place. And by place, I mean geography and not necessarily, city descriptions. And so because so much of Sudanese music was like about the roses that grow along, the Nile. And then B, I sonically just found it so peaceful, and I'm so grateful for that opportunity to explore that kind of sonic palette.
And a big part of your story too, and we'd be remiss in not bringing it up, is wrestling. Your first real taste of fitting in, really belonging, coming from pro wrestling, specifically writing wrestling fan fiction. How did your love of Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Undertaker and all those classic characters help you make new friends here?
Well, I gotta tell you, wrestling really does not ask a lot of you. Wrestling is like a story of good guys and bad guys, and even if you speak no English whatsoever, you'll be able to pretty quickly tell who the good guy is and who the bad guy is just by listening to the crowd and who they're booing. And so I was, for me, grateful to that, grateful to sort of have the opportunity to watch this show, engage with it in a way that other people at school were also engaging with it, and so that sort of became like an early bridge to some folks that I wanted to be friends with. Is that like at least we talked about wrestling, and by talked I mean I mostly sort of listened. And as time went on, I sort of found myself in a bunch of online communities where we write wrestling fan fiction, and we're talking thousands and thousands of words a week. And that gave me something entirely different, which is the opportunity to express myself without having to worry about what I sounded like, without having to worry about an accent, without having to worry about how I'm carrying myself that day, because I was still kind of getting used to all of this. And so I was writing before I was speaking, and I was really grateful for that opportunity because I had to have a lot of practice in terms of writing just thousands of words. I'm just trying to imagine scenarios and situations where these characters might find themselves.
As you put it, it was a world in which your words finally mattered.
Exactly. It was the first time that I could sort of settle into that and have that feeling without having to worry about how I sounded.
And bringing it back to this idea of elsewhere, you also talk about later in the book how your 4-year-old daughter and her relationship with her family history, her own elsewhere, as you put it. How do you think her experience is different from yours?
I think for her, she's a bit more solidified in here, right? Like, she's born in Canada. For her, Sudan is a bunch of stories that she's heard. She's heard that I'm from there. She's heard that my parents are from there. She's seen some pictures of my cousins, but it's still theoretical. It's still sort of like this other place. And so in a sense, I sort of have to work a little bit harder to cultivate her imagination about what Sudan is like, by sort of, by giving her as many stories as possible, so that she can think about this other place that she also has a stake in. And it's building that stake. It's sort of building that idea that, what, it also belongs to you. Your name is a bridge to that place. You will one day hopefully find yourself visiting that place. And when you do, I hope that you feel like, oh yeah, my DNA understands this. Like, a part of me sort of understands this. And so my hope is that the book will, in a way, be a connector to that.
What do you think this idea of elsewhere tells us about identity and belonging?
My hope is that it communicates a level of complexity that we're maybe not used to thinking about all the time when it comes to these identities. That you might inhabit identities like Black, like immigrant, like Muslim, but that doesn't always tell people how you feel about those identities or your relationship to them, and how it can be complicated, how it can sometimes take you a minute before you are able to claim it and say, I do belong in this identity, and there is a part of me that is a part that connects with this identity. I think the complexity of it all is something that I was hoping to communicate in this book. The fact that it's not settled, it's not simple, and hopefully do that through this journey.
And what do you hope people get out of the book then?
I hope that people will spend time with that complexity and sort of invite themselves to think about their own elsewhere, invite themselves to think about the other places where they might occupy a couple of identities all at the same time, and they're not quite sure whether they can feel they're able to claim it or not. I think that is something that is allowed. I think that is something that is hopefully universal, and I'd love to hear from people about, how this book might have changed their relationship to their own identity.
The name of the book is Son of Elsewhere, a memoir in pieces, and it's available from McClelland and Stewart. My thanks to author Elamin Abdelmahmoud.
John, thank you so much.